Millionaire's daughter never walked. Until Immigrant Maid did the impossible. Do you really believe that a person like you can cure my daughter? Richard Whitmore spat the words with contempt, pointing a manicured finger at Carmen as she silently cleaned up the shards of crystal scattered across the marble floor. Medical experts, the best in the country, couldn't get Sophia walking again, and you think your homemade techniques are going to work? The 16-room mansion echoed with the arrogance of the real estate billionaire, but Carmen Rodriguez continued to collect the fragments without haste, her brown eyes revealing a serenity that only those who have weathered far worse storms can maintain. The Czech crystal vase had shattered when Richard threw it against the wall in a fit of rage. All because Carmen had suggested, as gently as possible, that perhaps Sophia needed more movement and less isolation. The reaction had been explosive and revealing. This man didn't tolerate questioning, especially from someone he considered inferior. Carmen was 34 years old and never imagined that taking the job of housekeeper at that Beverly Hills estate would become a battle for a child's dignity, and her own. 3 months ago, when she crossed the border illegally leaving behind a young daughter in Mexico, her only dream was to earn enough money to bring her to the United States. What he found was Sophia Whitmore, a 6-year-old girl confined to a golden wheelchair, with sad blue eyes that seemed to have given up dreaming. Since a car accident 2 years ago, the little girl couldn't move her legs, and worse, she had stopped smiling altogether. The doctors said there was no damage to her spinal cord, but Sophia simply refused to try walking again. "Mr. Whitmore," Carmen spoke for the first time, her calm voice contrasting with his fury, "I didn't promise to cure anything. I only said that I know of exercises that helped my cousin in Guadalajara after she lost the movement in her legs in an accident." "Guadalajara?" He laughed cruelly, his gray eyes shining with disdain. "Of course, third-world medicine to solve what Harvard Medical School couldn't." He moved closer, invading her personal space, his breath smelling of expensive whiskey. "Listen to me, Carmen. You're here to clean, cook and look after the house. Not to give medical advice with your life degree." Richard Whitmore was known in Beverly Hills not only for his fortune of $200 million, but for his casual cruelty towards employees. He had fired the previous nanny for allowing Sophia to cry too loudly. The governess before Carmen had only lasted 2 weeks after he accused her of contaminating the girl with unnecessary hopes. What Richard didn't know was that Carmen had much deeper secrets than a simple immigrant should have. Before fleeing Mexico, she had been a pediatric physiotherapist in Guadalajara, a graduate of the Universidad Autónoma de Guadalajara. Her cousin was actually one of her patients, a girl who had started walking again after months of specialized therapy that Carmen had developed by combining traditional techniques with unconventional methods. And as he spoke, Sophia watched from the door of her suite, silent tears streaming down her face at the sight of yet another person being humiliated because of her. The girl had witnessed this scene dozens of times, her father destroying anyone who dared to suggest that she could do better. Carmen finished picking up the shards and stood up with dignity, facing the man who was trying to belittle her. Each crystal fragment in his hands represented the shattered arrogance of men like him who would one day meet their own ruin. "Excuse me, sir. I need to prepare Sophia's dinner." As she passed him, Richard sensed something disturbing. There was no fear in those eyes, just a quiet determination that bothered him deeply. It was as if she knew something he didn't, as if she held a trump card she hadn't yet revealed. In the corridor, Sophia discreetly held Carmen's hand. "He always shouts like that," whispered the little girl, her tiny voice breaking the woman's heart. "Mommy used to say that Daddy screams when he's afraid he won't be able to protect the ones he loves. But I think he forgot how to love after Mommy left." Carmen knelt at the height of the wheelchair, her eyes meeting the child's with a tenderness that Richard had never shown. "What about you, little one? Are you scared?" "Sometimes. But not of you," Sophia whispered, looking back to make sure her father wasn't listening. "You have kind eyes. Like Mom's." At that moment, seeing the child's shy smile, Carmen made a decision that would change both their lives forever. She wasn't just an immigrant desperate for work, she was a qualified professional who had helped dozens of children overcome physical and emotional trauma. And if Richard Whitmore thought he could intimidate her, he was about to discover that he had completely underestimated who Carmen Rodriguez really was. What Richard Whitmore didn't realize was that his cruel words had just awakened a strength that had lain dormant, and that very soon, he would discover that underestimating a mother fighting for a child is the most dangerous mistake anyone can make. Especially when that mother possesses knowledge that he never suspected existed. If you're feeling the heartbreak of this injustice, Subscribe to the channel because what's to come will show you that not every hero wears a cape. Sometimes they wear an apron and carry a strength that the powerful will never understand. Over the next few weeks, life at the Whitmore mansion became a silent battlefield where Carmen's every move was scrutinized with the precision of a microscope. Richard had laid down humiliating rules that seemed to have been created specifically to break her spirit. She couldn't use the main elevator, only the service stairs. Her meals were to be taken in the kitchen, never in the dining room, and most cruelly, she was forbidden to talk to Sophia for more than 5 minutes a day. "Carmen seems to be forgetting her place," Richard commented casually during a business call, speaking loudly enough for her to hear as he cleaned the office next door. "People like her always think they can take advantage of other people's kindness. But I know exactly how to deal with that." What Richard didn't realize was that every insult, every humiliating rule, was being mentally catalogued by Carmen. She had developed a photographic memory during her years of study, and now this skill had become her secret weapon. Every suspicious phone conversation, every document left on the table, every strange visit from men in suits, everything was being filed away in her mind with surgical precision. The final straw came on a rainy Tuesday morning. Carmen found Sophia crying silently in her wheelchair, staring out of the window with heartbreaking sadness. When she asked what had happened, the girl whispered that she had asked her father to try walking again, but he had coldly replied that she should stop raising ridiculous hopes and accept her reality. "He said I'm a burden," Sophia mumbled, tears streaming down her face. "That mom would have been better off if I'd never been born like this." The fury Carmen felt at that moment was so intense that her hands shook. But it was also at that moment that she made a decision that would change everything. While comforting Sophia, whispering that she was perfect and loved, Carmen mentally drew the first lines of a plan that Richard Whitmore would never see coming. That same afternoon, pretending to clean the office, Carmen discreetly photographed with her old cell phone some documents that Richard had left scattered on the desk. Contracts with construction companies, urban development agreements, and, most interestingly, correspondence with city officials that suggested something much darker than simple real estate deals. Richard arrived home that night drunk and particularly cruel. He found Carmen helping Sophia with the physiotherapy exercises that the girl herself had asked her to do, basic movements that Carmen had learned during her training in Guadalajara. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" he roared, advancing towards them. "I told you clearly that you're not allowed to touch my daughter." "Mr. Whitmore," Carmen replied with deadly calm, positioning herself protectively between him and Sophia, "the girl just wanted to try some basic movements." "You're not a doctor," he shouted, his face red with anger. "You're an illegal immigrant who should be grateful to have a roof over your head. How dare you question my decisions about my own daughter?" What Richard didn't know was that Carmen had recorded the entire conversation. And more importantly, that she had documents from her university education, carefully hidden in her room, which proved every word he had just questioned. The pediatric physiotherapist with a degree from the Universidad Autónoma de Guadalajara was about to show Richard Whitmore that he had completely underestimated who she really was. Sophia watched everything with wide eyes, seeing for the first time in her life someone stand up to her father without backing down. Carmen stood her ground, her brown eyes shining with a determination that made Richard feel something he hadn't experienced for years: uncertainty. "Excuse me, sir," Carmen finally said, her controlled voice masking the hurricane brewing inside her. "I need to prepare Sophia's dinner." As she left the room, Richard was left with a disturbing feeling that he had just woken up something that should have remained dormant. And for the first time since Carmen had arrived at his house, he wondered if he really knew the woman he had hired to look after his daughter. That night, after everyone had gone to sleep, Carmen discreetly called a number she hadn't dialed for months. On the other end of the line, a familiar voice answered, "Dr. Martinez, Children's Rehabilitation Clinic." "Roberto," Carmen whispered in Spanish, "it's me. Carmen Rodriguez. I need a favor that could save a child, and destroy the man who is preventing her from living." Richard's every cruel word had planted the seeds of a storm he would never see coming. And while Carmen planned her next moves with the precision of a surgeon, Richard Whitmore slept peacefully, unaware that his own arrogant words had just signed his sentence of defeat. What the prejudiced millionaire couldn't see was that every act of cruelty was creating the very trap in which he would soon find himself a prisoner, and that the woman he despised so much held secrets that would turn his arrogance into his greatest weakness. Dr. Roberto Martinez arrived in Beverly Hills in a discreet medical van, wearing a white coat and carrying a suitcase of equipment that he declared was for home neurological evaluation. To any curious neighbor, He was just another of the many specialists who visited the Whitmore mansion in the hope of finding a solution to little Sophia's case. What they didn't know was that Roberto Martinez had been Carmen's colleague at the Universidad Autónoma de Guadalajara, where together they developed revolutionary pediatric physiotherapy techniques that combined traditional methods with innovative sensory therapies. Now, 15 years later, he was running one of the most respected children's rehabilitation clinics in Mexico. "How did you get in here?" Roberto whispered in Spanish as Carmen discreetly led him around the back of the mansion, taking advantage of the fact that Richard was at a business meeting in the city center. "I told Mr. Whitmore that you were a neurologist specializing in complex cases, recommended by the Mayo Clinic," Carmen replied with a smile that mixed nervousness and determination. "I only charged $400 for the consultation, a price so low that even his arrogance couldn't resist the possibility of a cheap second opinion." Carmen's plan was much more elaborate than Richard could have imagined. Over the past few weeks, while pretending to be nothing more than a submissive housekeeper, she had meticulously documented Sophia's every move, every emotional reaction, every moment when the girl demonstrated physical ability that the previous doctors had ignored. When Roberto examined Sophia, his eyes shone with the same professional excitement that Carmen felt. Not only did the girl respond to neurological tests, she showed perfect motor coordination in her upper limbs and normal reflexes in her legs. Most importantly, when Roberto pretended to trip and fall dramatically, Sophia instinctively stretched out her legs to try to help him, a movement that a child with real injuries would never be able to do. "There's nothing physically wrong with her," Roberto murmured to Carmen as Sophia distractedly played with her equipment. "It's a classic psychological block. Emotional trauma manifested through functional paralysis. I've seen it before in children who have lost their mothers in accidents." But the most shocking discovery came when Roberto discreetly recorded some of the interactions between Sophia and Carmen. When the little girl thought no one was looking, she would subconsciously move her feet, swing her legs when she was excited, and even try to get up from her chair when she heard music. "Carmen," Roberto said gravely, "this child can walk. She chooses not to walk because she associates movement with the trauma of losing her mother. What's worse, the toxic emotional environment created by her father is perpetuating the blockage." That afternoon, Richard returned home in a particularly gloomy mood. His real estate business was facing federal investigations that he hadn't yet mentioned to anyone, and the last thing he wanted was to deal with yet another expert giving opinions about his daughter. "What's up, Doc?" he asked with barely concealed disdain when he found Roberto organizing his equipment. "Another miraculous diagnosis that's going to cost a fortune without any results?" "Actually, Mr. Whitmore," Roberto replied with the calm authority of someone who had treated hundreds of similar cases, "your daughter shows very encouraging signs of neuroplastic recovery. With the right protocol of sensory stimulation and behavioral therapy, I believe she could show significant progress in a matter of weeks." Richard laughed sarcastically. "Let me guess, doctor. You'll need more expensive consultations, specialized equipment, and in the end Sophia will remain exactly as she is now." "No, sir," Roberto continued unperturbed. "In fact, what your daughter needs most is positive emotional stimulation, therapeutic music, and trust exercises with someone she trusts completely. Interestingly, I've observed that she responds better to Miss Carmen's care than to any other adult." The suggestion hit Richard like a slap. "Are you telling me that a governess with no medical training is more qualified to help my daughter than Harvard doctors?" "I'm saying that your daughter needs love, patience, and positive encouragement," Roberto replied, his eyes meeting Carmen's with a look full of meaning. "And those qualities aren't learned at university, Mr. Whitmore. They come from the heart." After Roberto left, Carmen remained in the kitchen preparing dinner, but her mind was buzzing with possibilities. She now had not only a professional diagnosis confirming her suspicions, but also video recordings of Sophia's actual ability, evidence that proved the girl was being kept in an unnecessary prison by her own father's emotional ignorance. Most importantly, Roberto had left her a detailed protocol of therapeutic exercises disguised as games, specific music for neurological stimulation, and psychological encouragement techniques that could help Sophia overcome her emotional blocks. That night, when Richard was sound asleep after another bottle of Scotch whiskey, Carmen discreetly ventured into his office. Her documentary photography skills, learned over the years cataloging patient cases, were now becoming instruments of a much more personal justice. The documents she found scattered across the desk were even more incriminating than she had imagined. Fraudulent contracts with contractors, kickback deals with city officials, and most shockingly, correspondence detailing how Richard had used funds intended for children's hospitals to finance his personal real estate projects. Among the papers, one email particularly caught his attention. The federal investigation is approaching. We need to speed up the transfer of assets to offshore accounts before they freeze everything. The pediatric clinic can serve as a perfectly legal front. Carmen photographed each document with surgical precision, her years of medical experience teaching her the importance of meticulous documentation. But it was when she found the folder marked Sophia Medical Treatment that her blood ran cold. Richard had systematically rejected all the treatments recommended by the doctors, not because they were ineffective, but because he didn't want to give his daughter unnecessary hope. Even more cruelly, he had secretly canceled therapies that showed signs of progress, claiming to the doctors that Sophia had worsened when in fact she was improving. With her hands shaking with controlled anger, Carmen realized that she was dealing with something much worse than prejudice or arrogance. Richard Whitmore was deliberately sabotaging his own daughter's recovery, keeping her dependent to satisfy his psychological need for absolute control. At that moment, while quietly putting away the last photographs and reorganizing the documents exactly as she had found them, Carmen made a decision that would change everything. It was no longer just about helping Sophia to walk again. It was about freeing a child from a father who was using her condition as a tool for emotional manipulation. Richard Whitmore had completely underestimated the woman he had brought into his home. But he would soon discover that choosing Carmen Rodriguez as the target of his cruelty was the most expensive mistake he had ever made in his privileged life. Friday morning began with Richard receiving a call that made his blood run cold. "Mr. Whitmore, I'm federal investigator Sarah Chun. We need to talk about your contracts with the city of Beverly Hills and the embezzlement of funds intended for children's hospitals." While Richard stammered desperate attempts at an explanation, Carmen was in the next room executing the last move of a plan that had taken months to come to fruition. In her hands, a tablet showed the live broadcast she had prepared, not just for Sophia, but for the entire Los Angeles medical community. "Good morning, I'm Dr. Carmen Rodriguez, a pediatric physiotherapist with a degree from Universidad Autónoma de Guadalajara, specializing in childhood neurological trauma," she said calmly into the camera, her university credentials clearly visible in the background. "Today I'm going to demonstrate that a child considered incurable can walk again when given the right love and stimulation." What Richard didn't know was that Carmen had contacted not only Roberto, but also Dr. Patricia Morgan, one of the most respected pediatric neurologists in Los Angeles, who was watching the live broadcast along with 15 other specialists. Sophia was in the center of the room, no longer in her golden wheelchair, but sitting on a colorful mat that Carmen had prepared especially for this moment. The cameras captured every detail as Carmen applied the sensory stimulation techniques she had perfected over years of practice. "Sophia, do you remember the song your mother used to sing?" Carmen asked softly, starting to play a gentle melody on her cell phone, the same song she had discovered in Richard's late wife's personal notes. For the first time in 2 years, Sophia truly smiled. Not just a polite smile, but an expression of pure joy that lit up her whole face. And then, without warning, the miracle that Richard had forbidden himself to believe possible happened. Sophia stood up. Not gradually, not with help, but with a fluid, natural movement that made Carmen hold back tears of emotion. The girl took one step, then another, walking straight towards the camera with the perfect coordination of a healthy child. "Look at me!" Sophia shouted with joy, running around the room. "I'm walking! Carmen, I'm walking!" Meanwhile, in the office next door, Richard realized that his world was falling apart in real time. The federal investigator hadn't called by chance. Someone had provided detailed evidence of all her crimes, including photographs of documents he was sure he had kept completely secret. "Mr. Whitmore," the icy voice continued over the phone, "we have in our hands fraudulent contracts, kickback receipts and correspondence detailing how you diverted $2.3 million intended for children's clinics to fund your personal projects. You have the right to remain silent." It was at that moment that Richard heard something that made him put down the phone, the sound of small, quick footsteps running down the hallway of his house. Footsteps he hadn't heard for 2 years. Sophia's footsteps. He ran into the living room and stood paralyzed in the doorway. His daughter was not only walking, but dancing, laughing and hugging Carmen as if she were the most important person in the world. The live broadcast showed comments from specialist doctors confirming that Sophia's case was a perfect example of a psychological block, totally treatable with the right techniques applied by a qualified professional. "Papa." Sophia ran up to him, her eyes shining. Carmen taught me how to walk again. She's a doctor, Papa. A real doctor who looks after children like me." Richard looked at Carmen, who was calmly arranging her certificates and diplomas on the table, documents that proved not only her education, but also specializations in child neurological physiotherapy, behavioral development, and trauma therapy. "Impossible," he muttered, picking up one of the diplomas with trembling hands. You're really Dr. Carmen Rodriguez, CRM 4847MX, specialist in pediatric neuromotor recovery," she replied with the serene dignity of someone who has never had to prove her worth through the humiliation of others. "I worked in Guadalajara for 8 years before coming to the United States. I helped 127 children with cases similar to Sophia's." The live broadcast now had more than 1,000 viewers, including medical journalists, other parents of children with special needs, and most importantly, federal investigators who were documenting not only Sophia's recovery, but also the cruel and incriminating comments Richard had made about his own daughter during the secret recordings Carmen had collected. Richard's phone rang again. This time it was his lawyer. "Richard, we need to talk urgently. Someone has leaked information about your business to the press. The Los Angeles Times is preparing a cover story on the case. And there's more, there are audio recordings of you saying, compromising things about Sophia." As Richard realized the magnitude of his fall, Carmen knelt down next to Sophia, who continued walking around the room as if she had never stopped. The girl was radiant, finally free from the emotional prison in which she had been kept. "You knew I could walk, didn't you?" Sophia asked Carmen with the frightening wisdom of children who observe more than adults realize. "I knew you were much stronger than anyone gave you credit for," Carmen replied, hugging the girl. "And now the whole world knows too." The broadcast ended with an image that would be etched forever in the memory of everyone who watched. Sophia walking hand in hand with Carmen towards the camera, while in the background Richard Whitmore stood paralyzed, realizing that he had lost not only his daughter, his fortune and his reputation, but also the only chance he had to be the father Sophia deserved. The comments on the live broadcast multiplied exponentially. Job offers for Carmen were pouring in from clinics all over the country. And what about Richard? Richard finally realized that he had underestimated the wrong woman, at the wrong time, for the wrong reasons. As the lights in the room went out and Sophia fell peacefully asleep in Carmen's arms after the most important day of her life, a question hung in the air: could a man who had caused so much suffering find redemption, or are some bridges burned forever when they are built on so much prejudice and cruelty? 6 months later, Carmen Rodriguez was walking through the gleaming corridors of the Sophia Steps Children's Rehabilitation Center, the clinic she had founded with the donations that poured in from all over the country after the viral transmission. The name was a tribute to the little girl who had changed her life and proved that miracles happen when someone refuses to give up. "Dr. Carmen!" shouted Sophia, running down the corridor with the contagious energy of a completely cured child. "Did you see? Tommy managed to take 3 steps today. Just like I did on the first day." The center treated 50 children with neurological blockages similar to Sophia's free of charge, using the revolutionary techniques that Carmen had perfected over the years. The waiting list had over 200 families, and pediatricians from all over the world came to study her innovative methods. Meanwhile, on the other side of town, Richard Whitmore was sitting alone in a 2-bedroom apartment in a lower-middle-class neighborhood. His real estate empire had completely collapsed when federal investigations revealed a corruption scheme involving dozens of fraudulent contracts. His assets were seized, his accounts frozen, and he had lost not only his fortune, but also custody of Sophia. The girl now officially lived under the guardianship of Carmen, who had become her adoptive mother through a legal process that lasted just 3 months, record time thanks to the support of lawyers who offered to work for free on the case that had touched the hearts of the whole of America. "Carmen is my real mother now," Sophia had declared to the judge during the custody hearing, her little legs dangling from the courtroom chair. "She taught me that I was strong when everyone thought I was broken." Sophia's transformation was complete and permanent. She didn't just walk, she ran, danced, climbed stairs, and had become the center's official ambassador, helping other children overcome their own emotional blocks. Her therapy had revealed that her fear of walking was directly linked to the trauma of witnessing her mother's accident and the guilt that Richard had unconsciously imposed on her. Richard went to therapy 3 times a week, trying to process not only the loss of his fortune, but the devastating realization that he had been the biggest obstacle in his own daughter's recovery. His weekly requests for supervised visits were gently denied by Sophia, who had made it clear that she didn't want to see her father until he learned to be nice to different people. The irony was cruel and perfect. The man who had despised Carmen for being an immigrant now worked as a cleaner in a hospital, supervised by a Mexican nurse who treated all the staff with a dignity he had never shown. Every day at work was a lesson in humility that Richard would never forget. Carmen, on the other hand, had become one of the most respected pediatric physiotherapists in the country. Universities offered professorships, television producers wanted to document her work, and she had been invited to speak in Congress about skilled immigration and second chances. "You knew it was going to work from the beginning, didn't you?" asked Dr. Patricia Morgan during a visit to the center. "When I saw that broadcast, I knew I was witnessing something historic." Carmen smiled, watching Sophia teach dance moves to 3 children who had arrived in wheelchairs the week before. "I knew Sophia was strong. I knew Richard was wrong. But most of all, I knew that the truth always finds a way to come to light, especially when you refuse to accept injustice in silence." The Sophia Step Center had become a national symbol of hope and second chances. Carmen received daily letters from families who had regained hope, from immigrants who felt inspired to value their own abilities, and from children who learned that being different doesn't mean being less capable. The last letter I received came from an unexpected source, Richard Whitmore. In it, he admitted his mistakes, asked for forgiveness for the humiliations he had caused, and acknowledged that Carmen was exactly the mother Sophia deserved. "You saved my daughter from myself," he wrote. "I hope that one day I'll have the chance to prove that I can be the man I should have been from the start." Carmen hadn't replied to the letter. Some forgiveness needs to be earned through actions, not words, and Richard still had a long way to go before he deserved to be in Sophia's life again. That afternoon, as she watched Sophia help a new patient take her first hesitant steps, Carmen reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought them there. She had crossed the border as a desperate refugee, had been humiliated by a man who thought money gave him the right to destroy people, but had chosen to respond with competence, dignity, and an unconditional love for a child who needed someone to believe in his dreams. True revenge was never about destroying Richard Whitmore. It was about building something so powerful, so beautiful, and so transformative that his cruelty became completely irrelevant. Carmen had proved that the best response to prejudice is not hatred, but excellence. It's not bitterness, but success that uplifts not only oneself, but also everyone around. Richard Whitmore had tried to break Carmen Rodriguez's spirit, but instead he had unleashed a force that changed hundreds of lives, inspired an entire nation, and proved that underestimating someone based on prejudice is not just morally wrong, it's strategically suicidal. He had lost everything he thought was important: money, status, power, and control. Carmen had gained everything that really matters: purpose, family, well-deserved recognition, and the deep satisfaction of knowing that her life has made a difference in the world. And in the end, that's the only revenge that's truly worth it, turning suffering into success, humiliation into inspiration, and proving that those who try to diminish us only reveal the size of their own fear of the greatness we carry within us. If this story of overcoming injustice has touched your heart, subscribe to the channel and share it in the comments. Have you ever been underestimated by someone who then realized that they had made the biggest mistake of their life? The sweetest revenge is always that which proves that we were greater than our adversaries could ever see.